next guest is here, and he has been widely mentioned as someone who could be leading the Fed. Joining us right now is Kevin Warsh. He was a member of the Federal Board of Governors from 2006 to 2011, frequent guest here on Squawk Box. And Kevin, we are very glad to have you here with us this morning.
Becky, it's great to be with you. It's a slow, lazy summer day on a Thursday. I don't know what could possibly be on your mind.
By the way, we booked you before a lot of the blow-up that came yesterday with what was happening. But you are here, and you are somebody who has been mentioned on the short list for people who would be headed to the Fed. We've thought that for a long time. We've had people like Ken Langone, who was here earlier this week, talking about how he is a huge fan of yours. I just wonder what you're thinking right now, where you see things.
Well, I think Ken's a great man. He's an American hero. I came to know him when I started to work for Druckenmiller about 15 years ago. And I talk to him all the time, and I usually ask him what's going on in the real economy. Almost everything he touches turns to gold. And over the last 6 months, every month, he would just sound a little bit more positive about what was happening. And he told me something's happening out there that's different. And I said to him once, I might sound a little like Joe, I said, why aren't you more supportive of the president then? This is because of policy. And I think, listen, my sense is that this is, we're at the forefront. We're at a transformational moment in U.S. economic history. This is, as George Shultz told me before he passed, a hinge point in history. I think the president's language is this could be a golden age. And frankly, I think they all could be right. Good policies could advance this U.S. economy, what we call AI. In a couple of years, we'll just call business. And AI is going to make almost everything cost less, and the U.S. can be a big winner. That's my argument to Ken. I think Ken's now come on to the president's side.
That's what he said when he was here.
And it's a hugely exciting moment. If I were to step back for a minute, if I were the president, what I'd be worried about is a central bank that doesn't see any of that. A central bank that is stuck with models from 1978, governance from a prior period, and don't recognize we could be at the front end of a productivity boom. And if I were the president, I'd be worried that they might not see it. And they might think economic growth is somehow going to be inflationary. I think we were probably in the early innings of a structural decline in prices. Ken sees it on the front lines of real businesses. And I think if you look over the period of the next year or two, it's a pretty special moment.
We've been talking today about how far the Fed should forecast, how predictive they should be, if they should be dependent on data that's coming in. And, you know, there's one school of thought that says it would be better to have somebody who sees this and can anticipate in advance. That's what great money managers do. But great money managers don't always get it right either. We spoke earlier with Nick Timmerose, who made the point that, look, sometimes it's better to wait so that if there is a mistake, you can recalibrate much more quickly.
So I heard a little bit about that interview, and I heard Nick say something like, well, what we need is continuity. My goodness, I think that's the last thing that we need. The broad conduct of monetary policy has been broken for quite a long time. The central bank that sits there today is radically different than the central bank I joined in 2006. I don't think we need policy continuity that brought about the greatest mistake in macroeconomic policy in 45 years, that divided the country, that caused a surge in inflation. I don't think we need continuity when the central bank doesn't have credibility. Last September, Becky, as you'll recall, the Fed cut interest rates 100 basis points, 50 basis points before the election, 50 basis points after. Inflation was 50% higher then than it is now. And what did the bond market do when they cut rates? Long rates went up 75 basis points. That's a credibility crisis. So, listen, this isn't the first time you've heard me in the last decade say we need regime change at the Fed. It's not just about a person. It's about an approach to economics. It's about approach to what they're doing. And I'm troubled when I see them moving the goalposts. It is very puzzling to me, Becky, how you could think that we should do emergency rate cuts last September, and now all of a sudden you stand there like a hawk. That's not good for the institution. I don't think it's good for the economy to be changing the goalposts like that.
Let me ask you, as somebody who's been there before, how much power/influence the chair ultimately has if you're in a room with 11 other voting individuals who may not agree with that person? Historically, there's been sort of an alignment. Everybody's tried, I think, to come to a unanimity on most things. And whether you think that the Fed, I don't know if in history there have been times where there's been, complete and utter distinctions between views on the Fed and what it ultimately means.
So there have been exactly those times. Paul Volcker, when he came in, not only have 12 years of experience in government and 6 at the Fed, I've got some knowledge of Fed history. Paul Volcker came in and said, we don't need continuity, we need regime change. And it was that regime change that brought inflation back and reestablished the Fed as this beacon of credibility. But the president at the time put in some members under the Volcker team afterwards that forced what some thought would be a coup. It hasn't always been pretty. In fact, my own view, Andrew, is what the Fed needs is more robust discussion of ideas, less groupthink. I don't like it that everyone's following the same models. To give you just one simple example, the dominant models at the Fed, which might have been the best models there were in 1978, what do they think, Andrew? They think inflation comes if the economy runs too hot and workers get paid too much. That's not my view. I think we could use a new idea, a new theory of inflation, so let me practice one for you.
Okay.
Inflation happens when the government prints too much, spends too much, and lives too well. That theory that money has something to do with monetary policy, is nowhere in the central thinking at the Fed. I think if those ideas were imported into the discussion, we could have a good family fight about it.
You don't get to decide how much is spent. That's up to Congress, and the president has to sign off on those things. Would you support them? And I guess the biggest question, Kevin, is people are wondering, the next Fed chairman, is he going to be independent? Is he going to say, and I say he because right now the candidates that we're hearing are all men, is he going to be independent? Is he going to do what he thinks is right, despite what the White House may advise or think, what the administration thinks?
So in a word, yes. So I've strongly believed for 20 years, and history tells us that the independent operations in the conduct of monetary policy is essential. But that doesn't mean the Fed is independent in everything else it does. In fact, if I look at the track record of the Powell Fed over the last 6 or 7 years, they've tried to say, how dare you be critical of us? We're independent in everything. Well, that's nonsense. They wandered into climate change, a subject upon which they have no comparative advantage. With a change of this administration, they said, just kidding. They wandered into another political area of which they were never assigned, diversity, equity, and inclusion. They changed the remit that Congress gave them about whether they were in the business of full employment or full inclusive employment. This change in their definition in 2020 is one of the key reasons why we had the great mistake, the great inflation. And on spending, Becky, during the period of the last administration, what did they say to Congress? Spend, spend, spend. So like you, I think they should stay in their lane. But it's very strange to me that they're asymmetric. Spend a bunch of money when it's popular. And now if you get asked about spending constraint, what does the leadership at the Fed say? Oh, no, that's not about us. You should establish what the rules of the road are and stick with it, regardless of the administration. I think the Fed has done a very good job of blaming others for their mistakes. It's been very popular to blame the president because he's being so mean to them. Well, most of the Fed's mistakes are because of choices they've made. They've done a very good job in the business of politics. The inflation that has done huge harm to the American people. First, they blamed Vladimir Putin. It was because of the war. Then what did they do next? They blamed the pandemic. Supply chains, they would say.
Well, supply chain was legit for a lot of inflationary.
Well, it changed the level of prices because that's what happens in a market economy. But that's not what inflation is. Inflation is what happens to the Fed. The Fed is responsible for inflation. The Fed makes a choice about inflation, and the problem is the Fed has made that choice poorly. So they've got someone new to blame for all these mistakes, and a lot of their co-conspirators in the media seem to believe it. The new mistake is the reason why they're not doing the right thing on rates is because of the president and those tariffs. Well, he's being so mean to them.
I will say changing the goalposts.
That's not the cause of inflation. The Fed controls that.